Going to get started. My name is Daniela Bleichmer. I direct the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC. Thank you so much for joining us today for this book chat. I do want to invite all the audience, to turn on their camera if they are able to. It is much nicer to see the faces of friends and colleagues whenever possible. So please don't be shy and join us in not just with a name, but with your image if possible. Today we are going to be discussing Admire Mseba's Society, Power and Land in Northeastern Zimbabwe, circa 1560 to 1960, out from Ohio University Press in 2024. Our partners for today's book chat are the Hunnick History Department at USC and the Department of Anthropology. And joining us to discuss the book are Mariana Candido, who is Winship Distinguished Research Professor of History at Emory University, David Hughes, who is Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers University. And the conversation will be moderated by Lindsay O'Neill, our colleague in the History Department at USC. The program is very simple. We will first hear briefly from Admire, who will introduce the book to us, and then he will be in conversation with Professors Candido and Hughes for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. At quarter to the hour, we will open the mic up for questions from the audience. We will let you know when the time has come for questions and ask that you raise your Zoom hand and that you pose your question by voice, not through the chat. So that is our program for today. Admire, many congratulations on your book, and please tell us about it, for which you will have to unmute.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you everyone for attending. I see many colleagues across the country. I see my family around. I see colleagues in Southern Africa who have been gracious enough to join us because it's 8 p.m. in that part of the world. So I thank you so much. Quickly, so the way I thought about this book is I mostly spent all my adult life with the land reform in Zimbabwe, which began in 2000. And what struck me is when I entered graduate school, the first studies that were assessing this land reform were coming out. And even the most hagiographic of these studies, like those that really celebrated it, which were very few, pointed out something that struck me, that the land reform had addressed racial inequalities, but had not benefited women and the youth. And the question that and of course, the farm workers, most of whom were descendants of labor migrants from neighboring countries, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia, to some extent Tanzania. And so the question I asked myself was, why is this the case? And it seemed to me that in Zimbabwe, as in many settler colonies, apart from the politics of the land question itself, this is because of how the land question is framed in former settler colonies. The country's president, Robert Mugabe, kind of gave us that framing that, this was a colonial racialized problem, and it inevitably sought to address racialized problems. And of course, it was a colonial racialized problem. The racialized landed inequalities were all there for everybody to see. But I think what this narrative seemed to ignore to me was how one colonialism had entrenched many other forms of social difference, including gender and generation. So the question I asked was, can we learn something if we trace the land question to the pre-colonial period? And I was immediately, of course, the answer was yes, but I was immediately confronted with two long-standing assumptions that I had to deal with. One was that in the pre-colonial period, land was not the most important factor of production. Labor was, and of course, a bit of capital. And I understood from my studies of comparative slavery where this argument was coming from, and social relations, that it was an attempt to understand how Africans had enslaved one another before the Atlantic slave trade, and say because this aspect of production is labor. Also to understand something like polygamy, why would a man need more than one wife? Because they want more labor to till the land, which is plenty. And so the argument was that because of that, elites are more concerned with controlling people more than controlling land. The other question was that, which was a result of colonial indirect rule and early anthropological works, was that African land ownership is communal. And implicit in that argument was the idea that as long as one is a member of the community, the tribe, one could access land. What that seemed to ignore to me was that, of course, the community is not an egalitarian community. It has its own hierarchies. So essentially what the book tries to do is to engage these two ideas, to suggest that in the pre-colonial period, control of land and control of dependencies, they are not mutually exclusive, that leaders have to choose between these. They go hand in hand. And of course, the everyday hierarchies of social inequality based on gender, on generation, on belonging, shape access to resources, including land. And in the colonial period, the colonial state, through its policies, deepened these inequalities. And so in a nutshell, that's sort of the argument of the book. I will stop here.
I think we'll go alphabetically. So Professor Candido, if you have a question, take us away.
Okay. I hope you can see me and hear me well. I will start by thanking the Institute, the Levan Institute for the Humanities and the University of Southern California for organizing this event. I will start by congratulating Professor Mseba for the publication of this important book. And, you know, and in a way, I'm very grateful that we all have a chance to get together and talk about books and celebrate scholars writing book in this particular moment that we are living in this country. So thank you for organizing this event and helping us to think about our own work rather than things that are distracting us from our work. So I have prepared a series of questions and topics that caught my attention while I was reading Professor Mseba's book, and things that I would like to hear more your insights as you look at your book as a finished product in a way. You make several important interventions that might be clear to scholars working on African societies, but might not be so clear for scholars who might be interested in other parts of the world or historians in general. No, one of these interventions is the idea that you just mentioned briefly now, that land was abundant in Southern Africa. As you clearly show in different chapters, land was crucial. There was land, but there was also lots of competition on how to use this land. And you challenge a series of assumptions on how we think about land and land tenure in the African past. And I would love to hear more about your historical evidence. So one thing that became clear while I was reading a book is that you're combining rich primary sources. You're combining archaeological evidence with lexical analysis, oral traditions, missionary reports, a variety of colonial records, but also how people remember the past. So can you talk, or reflect a little bit on how these different types of evidence help you to problematize about the past and think about questions of land? I was thinking particularly on, now, of course, I am looking at my notes and trying to find which one is the chapter, but I cannot find here. Now, when you were discussing how Portuguese primary sources created in the 17th century tend to focus on minerals and authority. And you go on a long discussion on how it shapes how we think about the African past. So can you reflect a little bit on how primary sources shape how we see the past, but how scholars also become agents in shaping this past, which I think is a big intervention in your book.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for these sort of wonderful reflections. Yes, so part of the bringing together of these multiple sources is enforced by the fact that the Zimbabwean plateau, unlike West Central Africa, I didn't have much sources to work with, much written sources to work with for the pre-colonial period until well into the 19th century. So I needed to use archaeology and linguistic evidence and oral traditions to reconstruct this past in the absence of written records. And for the language evidence, it's helpful for the pre-1500 period. But what I sought to do was to show that, and the historical linguists had long demonstrated this point, but to show that by the time we get to 1500, speakers of languages that we now call Shona have words for certain social differences or certain hierarchies. And these are captured in the words that they have spoken and they have retained. And then put that in conversation with archaeology, which helps us to sort of put this in a broader chronological, allow us to give us a broader chronological sense of when this happened. And of course, the Portuguese documents become available when the Portuguese begin to interact with the Zimbabwean plateau after about 1505, because they learn quickly that it's the source of the gold that they encounter in Kilwa. But part of the argument that I want to make, the point I make there is that the Portuguese have helped to, the Portuguese and their writing helped to shape how later historians reflected on the Zimbabwean plateau. And the Portuguese wrote from the 15th century about the Zimbabwean plateau as a place where there were kingdoms, and the kingdoms were there. But I think this partly reflected their own background, that they were coming from Kingdom of Portugal. And in their writing, all the land belongs to the king, who then parcels it to his appointed favorites who help him to govern this. And of course, the Portuguese in the 1690s confront what became the Rose state, and they are defeated. And for a large part, they are responsible for constructing the Rose Empire, which colonial officials eventually also hop on with the help of the descendants of the Rose diaspora. And the Rose state, for non-historians, was the last of the glorious states on the Zimbabwean plateau that collapses when Anguni speakers arrive in the 1830s. And this diaspora moves, and some of them settle in the area that I'm studying. But because they are guests there, they recreate oral traditions in which they invoke their glorious past to say, well, we are not actually guests here. In fact, we have always parceled land to the people, including those people who have hosted us as guests. And this narrative is given to colonial administrators. But it's not just the colonial administrators and the Portuguese. In the 1960s and 70s, as African history, at least in predominantly white institutions, becomes professionalized, historians of Africa, it emerges in the context in which historians want to show that Africa had a glorious past, and the historians build on that and extend the idea that the Rosary was an empire. But it's particularly important because what they do is that they then look at the history of the Zimbabwean plateau from the vantage point of these powerful kingdoms. And they come across oral traditions of chieftainships that emerged after the emergence of the Rose state, which claim to have been given land by the Rosary rulers. And they show that as evidence of Rosary power. And what I'm arguing is that what this interpreting these sources is that it's seeing that from the vantage point of the Rose state. Of course, the Rose was the most powerful kingdom, but it existed side by side with many other chieftainships that were not part of the Rose state. And if we look at it from the vantage point of these other chieftainships, they are using the idea of Rosary authority for their own local politics that has little to do with the actual Rose power, because when chiefs that are appointed by the Rose elite are deposed, the Rose doesn't actually intervene to put them back, right? So this is part of a much larger sort of politics that has origins from Portuguese documents, is reinforced by the Rose diaspora and by colonial officials and by historians trying to show colonial states and others who are reluctant to show that Africa has a glorious past, which has continued to influence how questions of how land and power was allotted in the pre-colonial period is shaped. So that's what I'm trying to do there.
I don't know. Should I continue with my questions?
We'll go ahead and move over to Professor Hughes, and then we'll circle back to you for the next one.
All right, splendid. So I'm really pleased at this opportunity to discuss Admire's work. It's really a breathtaking narrative of the longue durée. I mean, most people don't go back to the 16th century. It takes a lot of guts in this part of the world. Concentrating on questions of the categorization, access, and contestation to land. So the book was a pleasure to read for the long duration, for the scope, and the fine-grained analysis of specific conjunctures. So I have a very basic question. What is land? It's in the title. What is it? I think the book does a fantastic job of tracing, and this is the part I found most amazing, the lexicon around land after Bantu migration to the study area. And Admire says that Shona speakers, they developed a fine-grained distinction of soil types and hydrological capacities and so on. Most of that vocabulary, as I read it, emphasizes fertility for agricultural production. This suggests a kind of utilitarian emphasis or approach to land as a factor of production. Of course, spirits live, and Admire mentions this, on land in groves and in pools and so on. But, from my reading of the book and my own fieldwork, it seems that the belief suggests that spirits live on those features. They are not of those features, of the pool, of the grove. They're in the grove, the spirit is. So I'm wondering then, does the linguistic evidence actually point away from a kind of spiritual or cosmological engagement between people, between their non-material forms and the material forms of soil and rock and so on? And is that because of people's origins elsewhere and the oral history of in-migration? So I guess I'm finding as a contrast, there are many Aboriginal groups in Australia that refer to the dream time, which is when the beings which created the world by walking along and leaving footprints. And so that the world is the footprints of the beings that created it. There isn't really anything in Admire's book that suggests that meaning to land. So I guess I'm asking you to clarify, Admire, is this a kind of an economic and ecological engagement with a definition of land that perhaps is lacking something for various reasons? Or is there more to it in your view?
Thanks so much, Dave. That's a wonderful question. So the way I conceptualized land here is at two levels. Of course, these were agrarian communities, so land was essential for production. But there's a line that I find very interesting in John Thornton's Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, where he's sort of teasing out what actually, where he's sort of teasing out the conceptualizations of land. And he says something like, land in its most essence is actually just dirty. It's the soil is just dirty. And I think the contestation is not about this dirty, but on the kind of benefit that's derived from controlling who gets to use it. So on one level, land is, of course, there is the utilitarian level, but I don't think that was the level that, I mean, the chiefs and the spirit mediums conceive land in this sense, but there's a second sense in which land is territory, as a landed domain that is controlled by chiefs. But I think the reason why they do not have the kind of narrative that the Australian Aborigines have is that that evidence doesn't come from the linguistic, as in the lexical data, but from the oral traditions, in the sense that in the oral traditions on the Zimbabwean plateau, the people who become rulers recall a time when their dynastic founders arrived and they found people who were already living there, right? So their deep time doesn't go back to sort of creation, to narratives. I'm not very familiar with the story of the Australians, but from what you are suggesting, it seems to me this is a narrative about, maybe a problematic term, but a narrative about autochthony, right? That they are the original people who arrived there and they found the footprints sort of tracing it from God. The oral traditions of the Zimbabwean plateau acknowledge that the chiefs arrived and found a land that was already inhabited by other people. But they then have to justify why they became rulers and then claimed this territory, right? And since they acknowledge that there were already people living there, they cannot claim that they were the original domesticators of this land, that their ancestors left the footprints. It's the ancestors of the people that they conquered who left this footprint. So they have so much of the oral traditions show a lot of creative energy in pointing the original people as somehow uncivilized. They don't have knowledge of making fire. They eat their meat raw, and they don't cook. And it's the immigrants who introduces these things. My reading of those oral traditions is suggesting that these guys don't have existing structures of authority. And so we have them, we introduce them to these people, and therefore we can claim their territory and we can turn them into subjects. And so that evidence, I think, comes from oral traditions rather than the lexical data itself. But I go to that point because I think it's a point about chiefs, about power, but the new rulers do not completely take away the authority of the people that they found there, because of course these people who have been there a longer time know how the environment works. And when things don't work, they go back to them so that these people perform the rituals that they need to heal the land or to do address calamities ranging from locusts to droughts to smallpox. So the people who are conquered are not absolutely powerless. And part of the argument that I wanted to make there was that, of course, the chiefs arrive, but their power is contested. So it's both the material. So what is land? It's both material, but it's also the territory. And because claims over power are contested, they bring us to the world of the ancestors. And so it's also this spiritual aspect of land that is both spiritual but also political.
This is one point that I really enjoyed on your book, is how you were pushing us to reconsider how we think about land, but also the vocabulary that scholars use when they refer to land in the African continent, forcing us to reconsider how we think about land tenure, this idea of communal land, and so on. But I want to talk about something that might not be evident by someone who hasn't read your book, and it's something that surprised me while I was reading a book, is the constant reference to women in political roles. So I would love to hear more your insights on why you think it's important to include women in political roles in the several examples that you discuss, but how also mentioning how women acted as rulers, advisors, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, how these ideas complicate the notion of women's oppression in the African past, which is so prevalent. So I would like to hear more your insights on women's role in the African past.
Yes, that's a very important point and question. So I was grappling with a number of things here that, of course, the starting point of understanding land, at least from the literature that I was engaging, was always the colonial and the colonial period. But in the colonial period, where we are starting from is sort of this invention of kind of a patriarchal rule. And African societies had been patriarchal in the pre-colonial period anyway. But it's tied, I think, to the idea of the invention of tradition, in which, of course, the colonial officials and later the people who produced scholarship learned about this from African men who were about losing their power from the colonial state. So what I wanted to do was to go back and so eventually the women are kind of obliterated from the history. The clearest example is that now we don't have any women who are either headmen or chiefs, right? But in the pre-colonial period, when I read these documents, they were there, but they occupied different spaces depending on their social standing. And so what I wanted to point out was that, of course, the chieftainships and the political power was a very patriarchal institutions, but patriarchal in ways that we have to understand in the African context here, in that at some point, some of these patriarchal institutions, some of their heads were actually women. And the logic of their appearance in the oral traditions, in the sources, but also in the Portuguese documents and in the colonial documents, is that there are women who participate in this power politics as part of, chess pieces in a game that's played by men. They enter when two kings want to establish an alliance, so they have a marriage alliance. And what I wanted to demonstrate was that, in fact, these women were quite powerful to the extent that when the colonial officials eventually encountered them in the early 19th century, they simply dismissed them as people who are living outside the bounds of what they understand, as bad examples of what a woman should be about. And so even in the third chapter, even the two nurses who bring Zimbabwean Plateau their baggage of Victorian womanhood, they are surprised when they meet head woman Chikanga, that he says, well, give me that whiskey. And they say, well, whiskey is for men. It says, well, if men can drink whiskey, why can I not? Right? And it troubles the sort of idea of patriarchy that they bring. But what I wanted to demonstrate was that these women were not just pawns in this chess game being played by men. These are actual powerful men. And even the etiquette of sitting for my Zimbabwean colleagues who are around here would know that the elders are the ones that sit on a chair. The juniors sit on the ground. And so when the woman sits on the chair and her hangers-on, who are mostly men, sit on the ground, it immediately tells us that who is in position of authority here, right? But at the same time, I didn't want to romanticize the pre-colonial past and say, well, the patriarch was not a factor, because of course, women, especially mothers, were conceived or were considered as outsiders, right? By virtue of the fact that these were patrilineal societies where marriages were very local, in the sense that the wife moved to live with the husband. She's essentially an outsider. And again, my Zimbabwean colleagues here would know that culturally, the father is your relative. You can slap him, but your mother is not your relative. You can't slap your mother. And that's sort of the essence of this mother, is a quintessential outsider, right? And that was that sort of weakened their positions in contestations over authority. So I wanted to acknowledge both the existence of, these patriarchal relations, but also demonstrate that women are not always there. They were not pawns. At least elite women from ruling families were not pawns in a power game played by men. They held real power, and that had implications over territory. The Portuguese give us, as they understand it, that these women control territory.
Okay. All right. I'm going to come in with another question here. I have a question about the relationship between core and periphery, or frontier and or center and frontier. So the population density comes up quite a bit, and I think Mariana mentioned it in terms of the scarcity of land. And Admire is at pains to argue that fertile land, particularly in the mountainous Nyanga region, is always scarce and an object of political struggle. And I learned a lot in that regard, because I'd argued exactly the opposite. That land was abundant until settlers seized so much of it in 1890, although that was about a different part of Zimbabwe. So the argument about scarcity comes out very strongly in your work, Admire. But elsewhere, you bring in Igor Kopitov and his idea of the internal African frontier, where younger men, aspiring patriarchs, and so on could wander off and establish their own polities with independence. So I'm really wondering, which is it? Is it an abundant frontier where people can go for freedom, or is it people packed in to fairly infertile rocky soils dependent on small patches with terraces and things like that? And I expect it has to do with where you're talking about and when, of course, which is the real question then. And this is something that Peter Salins brought up in a book about the Pyrenees a long time ago, about borders. Does the political change that you're talking about, is it driven by things happening at the center of polities or by things happening at the edges?
Mm-hmm. Yes, another wonderful question. So I thought a lot about that, but what I seemed to get was that, of course, I used the word frontier with a bit of trepidation because I expected a bit of pushback, but I got the comfort, I think, in something that either Kopitov or probably you, I can't remember who is who, but the frontier was actually not an empty land, right? In the sense that the idea of the frontier is used by the people who are expanding to that area, but it's not actually empty as is. There's nobody there. These people are just moving in land that they can take for grabs. But those who see the frontier as a frontier choose to ignore the people who are already in that area, right? And I think it's part of what the oral traditions are doing, right? When they are saying these people don't know how to make fire, they eat their meat raw, and we are introducing civilization. They are essentially trying to suggest that, yes, there are people, but they don't matter because they are uncivilized. So the frontier is not actually aimed, right? And so part of so what I'm arguing is, of course, it's difficult to demonstrate that land was scarce. But one of the things that I confronted was, why would people using hoes in the Nyanga Highlands spend their time digging terraces on mountain sides instead of just living and clearing new land, right? it suggested to me that they understood something that perhaps much later, reflecting the trauma of colonial dispossession, people didn't reflect, that these people understood that land might be abundant, but land with certain qualities that they were looking for was not abundant. And if the powerful see land that has qualities that they want, they choose to ignore that there are people who live there and construct it as a frontier. So ultimately, access to land, I think the point that I try to make, perhaps unsuccessfully, is that ultimately access to land is not about abundance, it's about power, right? It's about power,
Okay.
right?
Can I piggyback on that then?
Sure.
So, because I'm probably not going to have time for my third question, so I'll work it in as a half question. Because what I hear you saying, Admire, is that Shona speakers, when they were had access to or the desire to colonize a new area, used a discourse of empty land and of a kind of frontier of savages who had no rights, which is, of course, we know a lot about that from studying colonial settlers. So are you making an equivalence then between African settlement many centuries ago and colonial settlement beginning in the 1890s, that the same discourses came into play? Which, and my big question was going to be, since you have this time depth, are you in a position to relativize colonialism and say, well, it maybe was not as different from, it was not so extraordinary or exceptional because this is a region that has seen different forms of conquest, and now I'm hearing different forms of conquest using similar logics over this long span.
Yeah, so I hear what where the argument we are making, that this is a slippery slope, right? But I don't think it's peculiar to Shona speakers, right? I think it's peculiar to immigrant sort of communities, because I kept on thinking about the myth of Mbega in Stephen Fireman's Shamba Kingdom. Here I'm kind of taking the non-historians out of the list, but in the myth of Mbega, in the Shamba Kingdom in Tanzania, Mbega, the founder of the kingdom, arrives and he finds people who only grow cereals. But he's a hunter, which gives him a different qualities, right? Which enriches people's meals. And Fireman makes the point that if you're eating only ugali, mealie meal without corn, the starch without the protein, that's famine, right? When the guy arrives, he's essentially enriching these people's meal so that it doesn't become famine, it becomes a proper meal, but he becomes the leader. But implicit in that is an understanding that Mbega is an immigrant ruler, right? And he's suggesting that the people who became his subjects are famished, but for his generosity as a hunter who brings meat, right? And I think it's an attempt to explain encounter between immigrants who assume, who make a claim for superior status against the people that they found there. But I don't think it translates into, this was equivalent to what happens with the British South Africa Company in the colonial period, because of course it doesn't appear in the book, but in the oral traditions, there is a long poem that Zimbabweans amongst me would know, you probably know it, by Herbert Chitepo, so-called Snamsoro. It's 19 pages, it's an epic, it's the longest, where he gives an oral tradition of the founding of the Mtasa Kingdom and says, well, he arrived, he came with love and power, and so we made him king. I'm not sure any of the Zimbabwean, the people on the Zimbabwean plateau in 1890 would make a similar equivalence between Cecil John Rhodes and this guy who arrives from north of the Zambezi and came with love. So I understand that this is a slippery slope, but I think the oral tradition sort of, the leader, he has to be loved by his people. But what differentiates that from the colonial arrival of the late 19th century is that none of that love is shown to the Africans, right? So the founding leader of the of the Mtasa Kingdom is loved in these oral traditions. Cecil John Rhodes on the other side, I don't think we can say the same. But I think there's an explanation of how immigrants become rulers that is not necessarily reducible or equivalent to what happens when British settlers arrive in 1890.
Okay, we could carry on. Terence Ranger would have a different argument to make about Rhodes in Voices of the Rocks. Whatever the client, I can't remember the client lineages who did seem to appreciate him around Metopos.
I think we have time for one more question. So Professor Candido, do you want to give us the last question while everyone else thinks of their questions for our Q&A?
Okay, so but it is connected in some ways, you know, because this is a book about the past, but I can also see how Zimbabwe in the 21st century plays a big role on this conversation. It is a book that historicizes inequalities in a way. It shows that these inequalities existed for a long time. They are not new 20th century inequalities, but there was competition, there was marginalization, there was inequality in societies before the arrival of Europeans. So what is your aspiration in a way? You know, how do you want historians in Zimbabwe and outside of Zimbabwe, how do you want them to read your book? Or what do you expect that people will read your book and take it elsewhere? How do you hope historians will engage with your work and continue these conversations about inequalities in Zimbabwe?
A good question for me to reflect. So I'll answer it in this way. So when I was writing the postscript, which was a few years ago, newspaper reports carried a court case in which the post-colonial government had tried to appropriate this land in the southeastern part of the Zimbabwe, the Chilonga communal areas, as my Zimbabwean colleagues would know here, and had tried to appropriate this land and supposedly parcel it to some dairy producer who allegedly had connections to the ruling elites. And that was facilitated by the fact that under the now, this was a communal land, which is communal in the sense that is vested in the head of the state. But also under the post-land reform laws, all agricultural land is in the hands of the state. So with the signature of the Minister of Lands delegated by the president, anybody can be moved out of their land. And so what I wanted people to reflect, and this was at the back of my mind when I was writing this book, right? So what I wanted to reflect on is two things. From the pre-colonial period, there were inequalities in African societies. Well, African societies were like any other society. They had their honey, but they also had their bitter things. There were inequalities in African societies, but African societies had managed to keep the powers of their rulers in check, right? They had managed to establish these institutions that are rooted to the ideas of the fertility of the land that helped to check the powers of their rulers. And even in the colonial period, the colonial state attempts to turn traditional leaders into decentralized despots that Mamdani has argued with. I argue that that didn't really materialize on the Zimbabwean plateau. If it materialized, it depended on individuals. But by and large, it remained contested. The irony of it is, to get back to my prefix in answering this question, the irony of it is that as the post-colonial state sought to address colonial land questions, it ironically has just centralized authority over land in its hand, which allows it to do what it did with the communities, like those communities in Chilonga, with the stroke of a pen of the minister, evict a whole community. So what I want my readers to take is that from the pre-colonial period, there were inequalities that shaped access to resources, but African communities had attempted to check the powers of their leaders, and the post-colonial attempts to address one of the unintended consequences of the post-colonial state's attempt to address colonial land dispossession is ironically to centralize the power that had been contested in the hands of the state, which leaves everybody at the mercy of the state. And I think we all know the implications.
Great. Well, thank you all for all these questions, but we want to leave some time for everyone else to ask them as well. So if you can please use your raise hand function if you have a question under the React button. I'll give a couple seconds, see if anyone has one right away. All right. Well, that gives you guys think, and this gives me an opportunity to ask one of my 5 gajillion questions. So Admire, I have a ton of like specific questions, but I think I'm actually going to ask just a broader one because I think it's interesting for everyone to hear. But what was your biggest struggle in writing this book? Like, what was the hardest part? Was it the huge time frame? Was it your, kind of very creative kind of source use and trying to find those? What was the hardest thing about pulling this book together for you?
Wow, that's a huge question. I think, yeah, the challenge, I think, was trying to pull together these sources, especially in the earlier chapters where I have to pull in the linguistic evidence with archaeology and oral traditions, and then try to distill this that it becomes sensible, at least to non-specialists, because either of those sources can be very technical. One of the struggles was to try and see how I could make sense of the linguistic evidence and then put it in the footnotes, or just turn this technical, aspect of deducing historical data from language evidence to a historical narrative, and by the same way, distill from oral traditions and turn that into a historical narrative that's quite can be digested by readers. That was a big struggle, right? But it had to be done because, of course, the option is not to do it at all, right?
And feel free to use the raise hand function, otherwise Maya and I are just gonna have a really nice conversation here. But what did you come to the linguistic kind of evidence like first, or did you work your way first through like the archaeological evidence, and then as you're trying to find other ways to get into these questions, did you turn to it? You have all these kind of different sources that, historians at least don't often kind of use, and I'm curious as to kind of your progression to get to those sources.
Yes, so I first came to the oral traditions and archaeology, but I think this is the very rare opportunity where one's BA makes sense much later in life, because actually as an undergraduate at the University of Zimbabwe, I had studied archaeology, Shona, and economic history. And I needed the linguistic skills from my Shona linguistic structure and my archaeology, my work with archaeologists who had taught me archaeology as an undergraduate, and of course the history that I continued to read. But to write the book, I started with archaeology and oral traditions. But I needed to sort of contextualize this. So I went back to the linguistic evidence, or at least to the language evidence. I will say that this was something that I had to kind of, teach myself along up to a point where I thought, well, I think I'm comfortable to use this. But there is a huge, or perhaps not a huge, but a sizable, very vibrant scholarship on Africa that uses historical linguistics. And so that was kind of my go-to works to sort of find a track.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Daniela, do you want to pop in?
Sure, and this comes as very much a non-specialist, but I was interested sort of in the inverse version of the last question you were asked, which was what you hope that specialists will make of this book. I'm thinking about how, as historians, we write not just for our subfield, but for the discipline of history more broadly, hoping that our methodologies will be significant or helpful to people working in other areas. And I think that your book does is very interesting and useful for thinking about methods that we can bring. I feel that I feel like almost every talk that I go to these days, someone poses a question about critical fabulation. And I thought that it's not a term that comes up in your book. And I thought that you, without making it explicit, showed just how many tools historians can have for addressing archival silences and, you know, sort of a richness of evidence. I wanted to hear more about periodization because, as David mentioned, a longue durée, 500 years, is you know, a lot and is unusual in history as a discipline. And so I understand the sort of larger arc, right? Sort of saying that things connect over time and have an impact across periods. But I would love to hear you talk about the decision to cover 500 years rather than say, for example, do, I don't know, like 20 pages that are a prelude and then a focus on a more concrete period, which I think is a more traditional move. So what is gained and what is lost in this periodization?
Wonderful question, Daniela. So the periodization, part of it is the methodology, the sources forced me to do that. So both oral, the non-archival, the non-written sources kind of forced my hand to cover a much longer period because the oral traditions are notorious for lacking temporal specificity. But the linguistic evidence is even worse. And so is the archaeological evidence, right? Archaeologists work with the deposits, the archaeological, what's the word? The word is escaping me, right? But it just takes a long time, stratigraphy, just takes a long time for an archaeological stratigraphy to be formed. And so for these oral traditions and the methodological and the historical linguistics and archaeology, it kind of arms twisted me to take this longer view because, of course, as a historian, I was also concerned with questions of change over time. And in these sources, this change over time is kind of discernible after a fairly longer time. So that partly explains the long durée. But the second part of your question is actually very interesting in the sense that why didn't I have like, you know, 20 pages and then sort of the more move to the period that that is covered with written sources. And I will say that that was a political move. Let me put it in that way, that the period that is sources that are more convenient, or that most historians use, which are the written sources, is the colonial period, right? And so writing 20 pages of the pre-colonial period, or the last 20 years of the pre-colonial period, was almost like, well, you have this context of what's happening in the pre-colonial period, but actually the historical drama takes place in the colonial period. And so politically, I didn't want to do that because it was almost a suggesting that societies without written sources don't have a history. And my part of the politics was that, in fact, societies without written sources do have a history, and we can write it from the ways that they spoke and they left, and the traditions that they told, and the things that they threw away and accumulated in archaeological stratigraphy. But that then forces me to cover a much longer period.
Great. Thanks, Admire. We have about 3 more minutes, and I have Anna in the queue here, and then Brian, you have some questions in chat. So Brian, raise your hand if you want us to address those, and we'll try to get to you too, and Victor. So Anna, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Mseba. I was wondering if you could talk more about law, because, for example, for historians like me, in talks about the 19th century, this shift in law is kind of evident, or it's more clear, right? But I was wondering how you see this change in law throughout this period or in a long-term period. Thank you.
Mhm. So the law becomes, I think the question of law becomes especially visible in the colonial period, right? But much of that law was meant to achieve two things: to cement racialized land inequality, but also to use land as an instrument of rule. And part of the argument that I make is that the law said one thing. In fact, for the most part in Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, the law actually undermines the colonial states to attempt to use chiefs as instruments of rule, which is tied to the issue of communal land tenure, because it says chiefs cannot judge, cannot administer so-called customary law. If they do that, they are just arbiters. By the time they give the powers judicial authorities in the 1930s and 40s, and the attitude towards rural land has changed towards more, in colonial terms, more scientific approaches, right? But that's one way. But I deliberately kind of shied away from discussing the law and racialized land questions because there is much that has been written about that. But the law is important in the colonial period for sure. But I was thinking of what the law says, but also what happens at the implementation level.
We have sadly run out of time. I am sorry, I know that there's one more question in the chat, but we are exactly at time. This hour went by very, very fast. My thanks to Mariana Candido and David Hughes for taking part in this conversation, to Lindsay O'Neill to moderating. Many thanks to all of you for spending this hour with us. And above all, thank you, Admire, for giving us this wonderful book and this opportunity for conversation. Many, many congratulations.
Thank you so much.